"Arrest him," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the polished air of the showroom. And just like that, every conversation died, every head turned, every phone lifted, because nothing draws a crowd faster than a public accusation, especially when a man being accused doesn't look like he belongs anywhere near trouble. Ethan Cole stood there in a faded work shirt streaked with oil, hands steady at his sides, eyes calm. Too calm for a man being called a criminal. And that's what? Unsettled people first. Not the words, not the accusation, but the silence he carried like armor. Victoria Hayes took a step forward, heels clicking against the marble floor in precise, controlled rhythm. "This is the man who tampered with my car," she continued, louder now for the audience, for the cameras, for the story she had already decided to tell. A few people whispered, a few scoffed. Someone in the back muttered, "Figures." Because judgment is always easier when it fits the picture. And Ethan, with his worn boots and quiet posture, fit it perfectly. 3 days earlier, under a gray Texas sky stretched wide and heavy with rain, he had pulled over on the shoulder of Route 81 when he saw her stranded, hood up, engine steaming, hazard lights blinking like a quiet cry for help. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask what she could pay. He just grabbed his tools, stepped into the rain, and said, "Let's take a look." Simple words, steady tone, the kind that doesn't expect. Gratitude, only the chance to do what's right. She had watched him then with narrowed eyes, guarded, skeptical, the way people look at kindness when they're not used to it. He found the issue in under 10 minutes, tightened a loose fuel line, checked the pressure, wiped his hands on a rag, and stepped back. "You're good to go," he said. And when she reached for her wallet, he shook his head once, small, final. "It's nothing, but now." Standing under bright lights instead of storm clouds, she pointed at him like he had taken something instead of given it. "My car broke down again, worse this time, and my mechanic says it was deliberate," she said, each word landing like a verdict. The crowd leaned in closer, drawn by the promise of blame, of someone to condemn, of a story they could carry home. Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't defend, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the car parked behind her, sleek, expensive, untouched on the surface, and then back at her, not with anger, not with fear, but with something quieter, something steadier, like a man who had already seen how this would end. The room buzzed with tension, low and restless, like the moment before a storm breaks. And still, he said nothing, because sometimes dignity doesn't argue, it waits. The room did not erupt the way people expected. It tightened, like breath held too long, like judgment waiting for permission to land. A man near the front crossed his arms and shook his head. "You always hear about guys like this," he muttered. Another voice followed, softer but sharper. "Takes one look at a luxury car and sees an opportunity." And just like that, the story began to write itself without facts, without patience, without truth. Victoria stood taller, her confidence growing with every whisper that leaned in her direction. She adjusted the sleeve of her tailored coat, composed, controlled, certain that the room belonged to her now. Because it usually did. People listened when she spoke, they believed when she pointed, they followed when she decided. And today was no different, except for one detail she could not quite name. Ethan Cole did not move, he did not react. He did not even look at the crowd that was quietly turning against him. Instead, his gaze drifted for a moment toward the far corner of the showroom, where a small girl sat on a bench with her legs swinging just above the floor, her sneakers not quite touching the polished surface. Lily, 8 years old, watching everything with wide eyes that did not understand accusation, but understood tone, tension, the way adults changed when something felt wrong. Ethan's expression softened for half a second, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to anchor him. Then he looked back at Victoria, steady again, unshaken. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" her lawyer asked, stepping forward with a tablet in hand, voice crisp, rehearsed, built for control. Ethan answered simply, "Yes." The word landed quietly, almost lost in the room. A few people leaned closer, expecting a defense, an excuse, something louder, something desperate. But he did not rush, he did not fill the silence. He let it sit, let it stretch, because silence, when held long enough, forces people to listen. "I fixed your car," he said calm, Even, I did not break it. A scoff came from the back. Someone chuckled under their breath. The kind of laugh that dismisses before it understands. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. My mechanic disagrees, she replied. And there was again authority position. The weight of someone used to being right. Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he had already considered this, already walked through this version of events in his mind. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly. The air carried the faint scent of polish and leather. And beneath it all, something else, something quieter, the feeling that the surface of this moment did not match what lay underneath. Ethan took one slow step toward the car, not hurried, not defensive, just deliberate, and the crowd shifted with him instinctively like a tide. Pulled by something unseen, he reached the front, rested his hand lightly on the hood, and for a brief second, the room felt different, not louder, not calmer, just waiting. He did not open the hood right away, and that pause unsettled people more than any argument could have, because it felt like he was not reacting to the accusation, but observing something deeper, something already decided. Victoria crossed her arms, impatience flickering beneath her polished composure. Well, she said, her tone edged with control. Go ahead, show everyone. A few heads nodded. Someone whispered, let us see it. The pressure in the room shifted again, heavier now. Expectant, like a verdict waiting for proof. Ethan finally lifted the hood, slow and deliberate. The hinges creaked softly, and the engine beneath revealed itself under the bright showroom lights, clean, hand, untouched at first glance. Exactly what everyone expected to see. Exactly what supported her claim. A man stepped closer, peering in. Looks fine to me, he said, shrugging. Another voice followed. So what did he even do? The murmurs built, not loud, but steady, feeding each other. Reinforcing the assumption that had already taken root, Ethan did not respond to them. He leaned slightly forward, eyes scanning, not hurried, not searching blindly, but reading like someone familiar with a language no one else in the room understood. His fingers hovered over a section, near the fuel system, then stopped, just above a single bolt, small, almost invisible to anyone not looking for it. He did not touch it yet. He simply looked, and in that moment, something about his stillness changed the air again, like a quiet signal that something had been found. Victoria noticed it, her confidence tightened. Is there a problem? She asked, her voice sharper now, less certain than before. Ethan straightened slightly, then finally spoke. This part, he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying without force, was not installed by me. A quick scoff came from the side. Convenient, someone muttered, but Ethan did not react. He reached in carefully, not dramatic, not rushed, and pointed to the bolt. This is not standard for this model, he continued. It is over-torqued, wrong grade, and placed in a way that restricts flow. A pause followed, longer this time, the kind that begins to pull attention inward instead of outward. A man near the back frowned, leaning closer. What does that even mean? He asked, and Ethan answered without looking away from the engine. It means someone modified this system intentionally. The word intentionally landed differently. It did not accuse, it did not defend. It simply existed, and that made it heavier. Victoria's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders tightening. Are you saying I did this? She asked, a hint of disbelief creeping in her tone. Ethan shook his head once, small, controlled. I am saying, he replied, finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. This was already here before I ever touched your car. The room did not react immediately. There was no gasp, no sudden noise, just a slow, creeping quiet that replaced the earlier whispers, because doubt, once introduced, does not shout. It settles, and for the first time since she walked in, Victoria Hayes did not have the room entirely on her side. No one spoke right away, and that silence did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like something shifting beneath the surface that no one had prepared for. The man who had scoffed earlier leaned back slightly, his certainty no longer as firm. Another person stepped closer to the car, squinting, trying to see what Ethan had already seen, trying to catch up to a truth that had quietly moved ahead of them. Victoria let out a short breath, controlled but tighter than before. That does not prove anything, she said, her voice steady, but no longer effortless. My mechanic already confirmed there was tampering. Her lawyer nodded quickly, stepping in to reinforce the ground that was beginning to slip. Exactly, this could have been done by anyone, including you, he added, directing the last words toward Ethan with a practiced edge. A few murmurs returned, softer this time, less confident. As if the room was unsure which direction to lean, Ethan did not argue. He did not push back with emotion. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth, wiping his fingers slowly, deliberately, like a man who understood that clarity comes from patience, not volume. Then he spoke again. Your mechanic is not wrong, he said, calm, measured, and that caught attention immediately, because agreement was not what anyone expected. Victoria blinked, just once, surprised by the response. Ethan continued. There was tampering, he said, then paused, letting the words settle, letting the room absorb them without interruption. But not by me. The distinction landed clean, simple, undeniable in its structure. A man near the front tilted his head. Then how do you know, he asked, not hostile now, just uncertain. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the question, then pointed again, this time more precisely. Because this type of modification requires a specific tool, he explained, and it leaves a pattern, a pressure mark that does not match standard shop equipment. He moved his hand just enough for those closest to see. The small indentation, barely visible, but now impossible to ignore once pointed out. The crowd leaned in again, but differently this time. Not to judge, but to understand. Victoria's composure wavered for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking to the detail he indicated, then back to him. You expect everyone to believe that, she said. But the question carried less force than before, less certainty. Ethan met her gaze. Evenly, I do not expect anything, he replied. I just tell the truth. And there it was again, that word, truth, not raised, not emphasized, just placed into the room like a quiet weight that everything else now had a measure against. The lawyer shifted his stance, adjusting his grip on the tablet, searching for control. Do you have any proof beyond your opinion? He pressed, and for the first time, Ethan's eyes moved past them, scanning the room, not for support, not for approval, but as if recognizing someone. Then he said yes, a single word, steady, certain, and it changed the air once more, because confidence without noise is something people do not know how to ignore. And somewhere in the back, a voice spoke up, hesitant at first, then clearer. Wait, I have seen that before. And suddenly, the story was no longer only his to tell. The voice came from the back, uncertain but cutting through the tension like a thread pulled loose. I have seen that marking before. The crowd turned almost in unison, shifting attention away from Ethan and toward a man stepping forward cautiously, mid-50s, work jacket, grease under his nails, the kind of man who did not speak unless he had a reason. Victoria's lawyer frowned, irritation flickering across his face. And you are? He asked, sharp but controlled. The man wiped his hands on his jeans, eyes still fixed on the engine. Name is Robert Gaines. I run a performance shop about 10 miles out, he said, his voice steady, not loud, but grounded, the kind of voice built on years of doing rather than talking. He stepped closer to the car, leaning in just enough to confirm what he had already suspected. That bolt pattern, he continued, pointing carefully, that is not something you get from standard repair. That is custom torque work, specialized, deliberate, a ripple. Moved through the room, not loud, but noticeable, like a shift in wind direction. Victoria's posture stiffened, her confidence no longer expanding, now holding, containing. So what are you implying? She asked, her tone tightening. Robert glanced at her briefly, then back at the engine. I am saying whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, he replied, then added after a pause. And it was done before any roadside fix would even matter. Silence followed. Not forced, not dramatic, just real, the kind that settles when too many assumptions begin to crack at once. Ethan did not step in, did not claim validation. He simply stood where he was, hands relaxed, letting the truth build itself without interruption. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to regain control. That still does not clear him, he said quickly. It only introduces another possibility. But even as he spoke, the weight behind his words felt thinner, less certain, because The room was no longer leaning with him. A woman near the front crossed her arms differently now. Not in judgment, but in reconsideration. Someone lowered their phone, no longer filming with the same confidence. Victoria exhaled slowly, her gaze returning to Ethan, searching, not accusing now, but trying to understand something she had not anticipated. "You were saying you saw this before," she asked, quieter, more measured. Ethan nodded once. "Yes," he replied. "When I first looked at your car." A flicker of realization crossed her face, quick, subtle, but real. "Then why did you not say anything?" she asked, and this time it was not a challenge. It was a question, honest, uncertain. Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "Because you did not ask," he said simply, and the room absorbed that differently than anything else that had been said so far. Not as a defense, not as a strategy, but as something rooted in quiet principle. Robert straightened up, stepping back slightly. "He is." "Right," he added, nodding once toward Ethan. "Anyone who knows engines at that level would see it immediately." The lawyer opened his mouth and stopped just for a second, as if recalculating, as if realizing that control had shifted in a way he could not easily reverse. And in that pause, that brief hesitation, the room felt it, the balance tipping, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because truth does not rush, it arrives, and once it does, everything else has to adjust around it. The room did not return to noise. It stayed in that strange, suspended quiet where people begin to question what they thought they knew. Victoria shifted her weight slightly. The confidence she walked in with now measured, controlled, no longer expanding. She glanced briefly at her lawyer, and for the first time, he did not immediately step in. He hesitated, just a fraction, but enough for the room to notice, enough for the momentum to change direction. "Even if that is true," he said. Finally, adjusting his tone, trying to reclaim ground, "it does not explain why the failure happened after his repair." His words were sharper now, more deliberate, but they did not land the same way they had before because doubt had already entered the room, and doubt does not leave easily. Ethan listened without interruption, his posture unchanged, steady, grounded, like a man who had. No need to chase the conversation. He waited until the last word settled, then answered. "Because the restriction was already there," he said, calm, precise. "I fixed what was visible, but the internal pressure and balance remained." A few people exchanged glances, trying to follow, trying to understand. Robert nodded slowly, stepping forward again. "That makes sense," he added. "If the flow was already compromised, it could pass a short-term fix, then fail under load later." His explanation did not raise his voice, but it carried weight. The kind built from experience, the kind people recognize even when they do not fully understand it. Victoria looked back at the engine, then at Ethan, her expression no longer defensive, but searching, recalculating. "So you knew something was wrong," she said, quieter now, and Ethan nodded once. "I knew something was off," he replied, "but not enough to stop you from driving safely at that moment." He paused briefly, then added, "And you did not ask for more than that." The words were not accusatory. They were factual, and that made them harder to push back against. The lawyer shifted again, less certain. "You were suggesting this was a pre-existing issue," he said, but even his phrasing had softened, no longer declaring, now asking. Ethan met his gaze. "I am not suggesting," he said. "I am explaining." And that difference, subtle as it was, settled into the room with quiet authority. A man near the front lowered his arms, uncrossing them, slowly, as if releasing a position he no longer fully believed in. Someone else stepped back, giving space, giving perspective. Victoria exhaled, longer this time, her eyes moving between the engine, Robert, and Ethan, piecing together something she had not expected to confront. "Then who did this?" she asked, almost to herself. And that question did not echo loudly, but it changed everything, because it shifted the focus away from blame and toward truth. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at the engine once more, then at the small, precise detail that had started all of this, and finally said, "Someone who wanted it to fail." And the room did not react with noise. It reacted with stillness, because intent, once introduced, carries a different kind of weight, one that silence understands better than words. The question did not echo loudly, but it lingered, settling into every corner of the showroom, like a quiet weight that no one could ignore. Someone who wanted it to fail, Ethan had said, and now that idea hung in the air, shifting the entire direction of the room. People were no longer looking at him the same way. They were looking past him, around him, searching for something else, something unseen. Victoria's expression tightened again, not with anger, but with realization, the kind that arrives slowly, piece by piece. "That does not make sense," she said, though her voice carried less certainty than before. "Why would anyone do that?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He glanced once more at the engine, then stepped back slightly, giving the space back to the room, to the question, because some answers are not meant to be given, they are meant to be found. Robert folded his arms, thinking, "It is not random," he said after a moment. "This kind of work is precise, intentional, not something done out of carelessness." A man near the back nodded slowly. "So it was planned." He added, more to himself than anyone else. The word planned shifted the tension again. Deeper now, less about embarrassment, more about implication. Victoria's gaze dropped briefly to the floor, then lifted again, sharper, focused. "My car has been serviced at the same dealership for years," she said, almost defensively. "They know what they're doing." The statement felt less like confidence and more like something she needed to hold on to. Ethan watched her quietly, then spoke. "Consistency does not guarantee integrity." The sentence was simple, but it landed with weight because it did not accuse. It revealed a possibility, and possibility is enough to change how people see everything. The lawyer stepped in again, but his tone had shifted, less commanding, more cautious. "Are you suggesting a professional shop would risk something like this?" he asked, but even he did not sound convinced of his own resistance. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I am not suggesting who," he replied. "I am explaining what." The distinction settled again, clean, controlled, and it redirected the focus back to the evidence, not the assumptions. Victoria looked back at the engine, then at Robert. "Could this have been missed during inspection?" she asked, quieter now. And Robert hesitated, not long, but honestly, "Not by someone experienced," he said, and that honesty carried more weight than certainty ever could. The room absorbed that answer slowly, like a realization that could not be rushed. Ethan's eyes moved briefly toward Lily again, still sitting quietly, still watching, and something about that grounded him even further. He turned back to the car, then said, "There's one more thing." The words were not loud, but they shifted attention instantly because by now, everyone had learned that when he spoke, it mattered. He stepped forward again, reaching carefully into the engine, not to adjust, not to fix, but to reveal. His fingers traced along a hidden edge, then stopped, and with a slight movement, he exposed a small, nearly invisible marking etched into the metal. Something no one had noticed before, something no one had been looking for. And when he stepped back, the room leaned in, not out of curiosity now, but out of understanding that whatever came next would not be guesswork, it would be truth. The marking was small, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, a thin etch along the inner edge of the metal, precise, intentional, and completely out of place for a standard repair. Ethan stepped back just enough for others to see, not forcing attention, simply allowing it, and one by one, people leaned in, closer now, quieter now. The man named Robert narrowed his eyes, then exhaled slowly. "That is not from a dealership," he said, his voice lower than before, more certain. "That is a signature." The word landed differently than anything else, not technical, not mechanical, but personal, and that shifted the weight of the moment again. Victoria's gaze locked onto the marking, her brows drawing together as recognition began to form. Not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle her composure. "A signature," her lawyer repeated, but there was hesitation in his tone now, less challenge, more uncertainty. Ethan nodded once. "Some technicians leave identifiers," he explained, "not official, not documented, but consistent." He paused briefly, letting the room follow. "Patterns, marks, habits." Robert stepped closer, pointing carefully without touching. "I have seen this before," he said more firmly now, "a shop out on Westbrook Industrial. They do custom performance work, high-pressure systems, not always by the book." A murmur moved through the room again, but softer, more focused, like pieces beginning to connect instead of scatter, victorious. Expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. Her eyes flickered with something sharper, something more personal. Westbrook, she repeated quietly, and that word carried memory, not speculation. Ethan watched her, not pressing, not guiding, just present, allowing the realization to unfold at its own pace. The lawyer shifted again, but this time he did not interrupt, because interruption requires certainty, and certainty was no longer his. Victoria took a slow breath, then another. Her posture straightening, not out of control, but out of clarity forming. They handled my last full system. Upgrade, she said almost to herself, and the room absorbed that, not as an accusation, but as a missing piece finding its place. Robert nodded once. That would explain it, he said. This kind of modification is not accidental, and it is not roadside work. Ethan remained still, his role complete, his explanation given. No need to add more, no need to claim anything, because the truth had moved beyond him now. It belonged to the room, to the realization building in front of everyone. Victoria looked at him again, but differently this time. Not with suspicion, not with authority, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding. And in that moment, the narrative she had walked in with no longer held. It had been replaced, not by force, not by argument, but by something far more difficult to ignore: quiet evidence, steady presence, and a truth that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. No one rushed to speak, not the lawyer, not the crowd, not even Victoria, because the truth had already arrived and it did not need anyone to announce it. It simply settled, quiet and undeniable, like dust after a long storm. Victoria stood still for a moment, her eyes lingering on the marking, then slowly lifting to Ethan, and this time there was no accusation in her gaze, only recognition. The kind that comes when a story you believe begins to fall apart in your hands. She took a step forward, her heels softer now against the marble, less sharp, less certain. I was wrong, she said, her voice steady but lower, and the words did not echo loudly. But they carried, because silence makes space for honesty in a way noise never can. The lawyer shifted beside her, clearly uncomfortable, clearly unprepared for a reversal he could not control, but he said nothing because there was nothing left to argue. The room remained still. Watching, listening, recalibrating, Victoria continued. I should not have come here like this, she added, her tone measured. Not dramatic, not defensive, just honest. Ethan nodded once, a small acknowledgement. Not victory, not pride, just acceptance, because for him, this was never about winning. It was about truth, and truth had already done its work. Lily shifted on the bench, her small shoes finally brushing the floor as she slid down and walked quietly toward her father, her hand finding his without hesitation, without fear, and Ethan's expression softened again, just for a moment, enough to remind anyone watching what really mattered. Victoria noticed it, the child, the quiet bond, the stillness in the man she had misjudged, and something in her posture changed again, not outwardly, but deeply. Thank you, she said almost quietly, and the words were not for the repair, not anymore, they were for something else, something harder to name. Ethan looked at her, then at the car, then back at her and replied simply, I fix things, he said, his voice calm, grounded. I do not break them. And that was all. No lecture, no explanation, no need to revisit what had already passed. The room held that sentence differently than anything before because it was not just about the car, it was about character, about the kind of strength that does not need to prove itself loudly. One by one, people stepped back, not out of disinterest, but out of respect. The phones lowered. Completely now, no longer searching for a moment to capture because the moment had already happened, and it was not something that could be replayed, it was something that had to be understood. Victoria turned slightly, her attention shifting toward the exit, but before she left, she paused just long enough to look back once more, not at the engine, not at the crowd, but at Ethan, standing exactly as he had been, steady, quiet, unchanged, and then she walked away, and no one stopped her now. One followed, because the room itself had already moved on, not in noise, but in silence, the kind of silence that does not come from emptiness, but from understanding.